have some housekeeping business here. This morning is a session that lasts till noon. Mark and I worked these things out very roughly, and he'll talk to you this morning about body and boundary, and then that will lead to discussion and so on. And that's it. Mark, there you have it.
Morning, everyone. Those of you who joined us for yoga, hopefully right now you're glowing at least a little bit inside. I actually found the amount of energy in the room, particularly when we were meditating at the end, to be outstanding. I do that meditation a lot, and I was almost blown over a couple of times by the amount of energy that was in the room. I'm going to spin a myth, a story, and it's a scientific story, maybe, and it has scientific verifiability. Verifiability? Maybe.
Verisimilitude. Veracity.
Veracity. Maybe. You can put it to the test by yourself. You can put it to the test in large populations. And might be the foundation for an understanding of where we are right now. So I want to flash back to 1992. And I've gone to San Francisco, and I've turned my basement into a laboratory, and I'm building head-mounted displays with ocular components so poor that I can focus on almost any source now. And we're sticking our head into virtual worlds, and we're building very simple things. And we're just exploring, which is really all anyone is doing at this point in time. And at the same time, I'm starting to get this rising sense of ontological uncertainty about what the real is. That my psychedelic experience is starting to conflate with my experience about reality as it is in a non-psychedelic state. And I don't really think I know what's going on. Fortunately, serendipitously at this point in my life, in walks a bona fide mad scientist. And his name is Dr. David Warner. And David Warner, at that time, was at the Loma Linda Medical Research Center in Riverside. And these days, he runs the Center for Really Neat Research. No kidding. At Syracuse University. Really neat. Center for Really Neat Research. At Syracuse University. And Dave's trip, in particular, although he has a degree in philosophy and a degree in neuroscience, his trip used to take really cheap little electronic pieces and work them so that they can enable children who've had severe cerebral or neurological injuries. So say a child who had an accident coming out of the womb and has a break at their second vertebra, which means they can't even breathe without a respirator. Well, what kind of life can that child have? Well, that child, whom they got when she had barely been born, is now planning actually on becoming, I guess, a rocket scientist. Because she's been outfitted, even in her wheelchair, with very simple sensors that can read her eyes, and things like this that can enable her. And all of this used to cost tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. But in fact, there's so much technology, so much detritus lying around, that if you think about it creatively and you think about it from your heart, how can I help this person? You can slap things together in any particular order and come up with things that are completely amazing. And we don't normally think about it like that. We think about it like big science, like you have to really go to work and engineer the problem. We don't think of it as something you can simply hack together to enable a person to become whole, or at least to be able to effectively allow them to communicate with you in the outside world. Because that's what we're talking about, is the spinal cord in that sense is our facility for communication. So when I say that the sun rises and sets on Dr. Dave, this is what I believe, and most of the people who've ever met him tend to think the same thing. He's a bona fide mad scientist. He'll never be rich. He might someday be famous for being a mad scientist, but he has an awful lot to say about why we do things. He's definitely, he started off his career as a Marine Corps drill instructor, so he can be very, very persuasive. And over the course of 1992, I got a horse doctor's dose of his persuasion. So you can picture this evening in a sort of musty San Francisco basement in front of a great big chalkboard, and I got a spiel, which he at that time was calling perceptual cybernetics, which is something I'm still using as a word. It's a great big double word. He also calls it neurocosmology now. And it's to deal with the way that media or information in the universe interact with us. Now that said, what I'm presenting to you is a model. It's not the God's honest truth. You can probably poke holes in it, but it's useful to understand certain things. So we're going to take the entire universe right now, and we're going to trisect it. And I'm going to say, okay, everything that's outside of me, the physical reality, objective or subjective, we're going to call that phi. Sort of physical. You can think of it that way. Then we're going to take the universe of the interior. Everything you're thinking or feeling. The things that you have to struggle to communicate because they're innate inside of you, but they don't always get out. We're going to call that psi for the psychic realm. And then we're going to take the body, the physical being, this thing that sits between, and that's the very important point here. And we're going to call that fex. I think he has another name for it now, which is slightly more romantic. Or we could go to the William Gibson term and call it the meat, and we'll come back to that. And it's not important what's in Island 1, or Island 2, or Island 3. What's important is that there are boundaries between them. And I will give you two examples to illustrate these boundaries. Exhibit A, a remote control. Now note, it'll turn the VCR on and off. Did you see anything? No. It's infrared light coming out of here. You can't see infrared light. You can't parse the information. So this is information that's freely available in the physical world, but it's being stopped at the boundary to your body, that boundary between the physical and the body, because you aren't equipped. You don't have the sensors to actually be able to see it. So that's one layer. There's a very natural layer that's there that's actually separating us from the world at large. Second example. Watashi wa midori no chisai no shito desu. I just said, I'm a little green man. In Japanese, for those of you who can speak Japanese and can understand my decidedly poor pronunciation of it, you have an internal interface between your ears and the parts of your brain that process sound and your understanding, your higher functions. But if you don't, then that information is simple noise. It gets stopped at the interior boundary between the meat and your understanding. So we have at least two basic types of barriers to information. So that's the theory as Dave taught it to me. What I became aware of over the period of time that I continued to work in virtual reality, and in fact this became, I guess it sort of burst on me in a very clear sense after a psychedelic experience, that in fact what I was working on in virtual reality, what interactive media, what media themselves are all about, are about retuning or changing the qualities of these interfaces that we innately possess, either by our physical or by our learned and acquired characteristics. So for example, you could go get a set of those cheapy Soviet infrared night vision goggles that are on the market now because the company's gone out of business, and you could see the information coming out of this. You can equip yourselves, you can augment yourselves in such a way that this becomes a visible reality. Or you could go take a short course in Japanese, and believe me, you wouldn't need to know much Japanese to understand what I said. And you could equip yourself internally with this interface. Now we normally call that interface learning. Okay? But in some sense, what we're doing is we're equipping ourselves internally with a tool, with a mechanism, with an augmentation that allows us to understand it. So the goal, in some sense, with VR, and certainly Jaron Lanier, who's considered to be the father of virtual reality, evoked a word or a phrase which he said was post-symbolic communication. I read that phrase, I don't get much information out of it except I get an intuition that this means that we can go directly from one mind, one psi, to another psi without any intervening. So that the job, the grand project of virtual reality is to mediate away the functioning of the interface between the outside world and your body and the interior world. That said, if this is the direction, if that's the vector of our approach, the closer we get to it, the closer we get to a condition of more or less perfect fidelity between one psychic state and another, transmitter and receiver. In the condition where that transmission is perfect or near perfect, I took a look at that and realized we already had a name for that state in English. And this is what frightened me, because the word for that state in English is a cyborg. If you think about, it's very interesting because science fiction, particularly pop science fiction, and in specific Star Trek, has been popularizing the notion of the Borg, where the individual has been sublimated to a collective will which can forcibly insert its own norms, its own means into a body, and thus make that body a slave agent. Let's go back and talk about boundaries. The boundaries of your body, the boundaries where you exist, both internal and external, are there for a reason. They keep you alive. The absence of boundary is not a condition that is normally associated with living systems. When you lose your boundaries, or when you bridge them without thinking about what you're doing, you can die very quickly. So the boundaries that exist in us to biology, to information, exist in order to preserve the integrity of yourself. So any attempt to move across those boundaries has to be considered very carefully, because the kinds of things that flow across those boundaries change the qualities of those boundaries. This is what I meant when I said last night that every word you hear, every bit of information that you encounter, changes you. But this is the human condition. That's the other side of the coin. The human condition, ever since the first woman uttered the first word and sent something across the void, actually bridged the gap of perception from one mind into another mind. This has been going on. So there might have been some point in the past where a human being was a self-contained unity, but that also might have been a pre-human state. It may be that the nature of what it means to be human is that we are in fact constantly in a state where that human gulf is being bridged, where other people are putting parts of themselves into you, and you are responding by putting parts of yourself into them. So we have to accept this as a condition of being alive, of being communicating beings in a culture. So there's this fundamental tension, because there's this drive to connect, and then there's this drive to be separate. So we have two sorts of outcomes that could happen from any possible flow like this. You could have, for instance, the rape of the Borg, or you could have the consummation of seduction, of the joining, of the merging. And these forces are constantly at odds. And every piece of media that we create, and as we get better and better at evoking a particular psychic state, we're getting further and further along that line. Each one of these artifacts contains both the potential to rape or to dominate. And so this is why, to come back to it, it's important to work with heart, because when you work with heart, the drive or the innate desire within you is to consummate the relationship of communication and not use it as a vector for contamination and rape. Let's take, for example, and I want to use this as a general example, the cellular phone. I'm one of the few people I know in Los Angeles who still does not have a cellular phone. I don't know how it's happened, it's just happened. But I've seen something happen time and time again with all of my friends as they get the cell phones. The first thing you hear is, oh, well, I just need it for work, or I just need it for a few calls. That's day one. By day 14, give or take, it's been thoroughly incorporated into their ontology. It's a form and a mechanism of communication that they have adapted to. It's a near form of telepathy. It's immediate, it's present, it's attached, it goes with you everywhere, and it's suddenly indispensable. Day 1, you didn't need it at all. Day 14, you can't live without it. And so what we do is, as the information flows between ourselves and the device, we adapt to the device, and the device is incorporated into our understanding of the world and how the world works. And you can say the same thing about the television or the radio or virtual reality. I'll stop there and we can come back.
I like the idea about how we are almost like social insects, that we're generating the equivalent of informational pheromones, and that these memes and linguistic structures that we generate are designed usually to impact other people's behavior, which is what pheromones do in insect societies. So, and I also was interested in what you said earlier about the interfaces between the boundaries. It seems to me that one of the things we're going to have to get used to is states of being that are very non-referential to meat, and that it's very hard to, that essentially what the body is a kind of metabolic knot in time, and so everything is perceived through the energetic unraveling of metabolism. It's what makes life possible. But on the other hand, you can build from that platform into areas that are not so clouded by the fact of an animal body. I think psychedelics, especially the high-dose ones, seem to show this. So I'm imagining one of the things that we're going to have to get used to is points of view that are not human at all, but that will be ours, to put up and take down as we want. There's the idea also of looking out at nature, making that, maybe what the program of consciousness is about is a re-infusing of all of nature with self-reflection, so that every eye that looks out at the world leads back to the global mind, whether cybernetically maintained or maintained in some other way. In other words, we're like causing nature, well, not causing, cause and effect is tricky here, but we are part of an emergent phenomenon of nature's self-awareness. nature as information is somehow in an embryonic state, and human societies as purveyors and generators of information have become the medium of this dynamic which infuses us as animals with the presence of, I don't know, spirit, the divine, an awareness of hyperspace, something like that. Everybody who's heard me more than once knows that I think of psychedelics as essentially boundary dissolving agents, that's what they do. Culture is the antithesis of this. Culture is a limited game, a limited piece of software run on a machine much more powerful than it is, and it defines behavior. Well, Mark is right. If you breach really deep boundaries, you die very quickly. If you insist on stepping into high vacuum or walking on the bottom of the lake without the benefit of scuba equipment, you quickly cease to be a functioning being. On the other hand, there's some kind of tension. Culture is a compromise. You know, Freud titled one of his books Civilization and Its Discontents, meaning that civilization was a kind of fallen state that we had put upon us or took upon ourselves as an act of self-limiting. And in a way, I seem to gravitate toward these tunnel images when I think about virtual reality and psychedelics, because what I see them as is some kind of redemptive possibility that will make the historical experience make sense, in the sense of it will somehow make history worth the trip. You know, I think one of the most horrifying visions in all of 20th century political dialogue is the discourse between the interrogator and Winston Smith in 1984, where the interrogator says to him, "Do you know what history is?" And he says, "No, what is history?" And he says, "History is a human boot smashing into a human face forever." Well, this is, this is unacceptable. This is inconceivable, and the overcoming of it is by turning the tools that these pathological behaviors created out of science and positivism and so forth into actual elevators of human potential and intent. And the boundary issue is critical. In a way, I think what's happening is we are becoming many species. You know, in H.G. Wells' Time Machine, in the distant future, there were subterranean machine hive people, and then there were the free-spirited, witless, surface people. It's a more serious fragmentation than that. Greg Egan, in his science fiction, says the real ethical challenge of the future is to preserve the very notion of a human species. You know, some of us may choose to leave the body entirely, if that is possible, and migrate into digital castles in the imagination that can exist in some kind of synthetic eternity of some sort. Other people might choose to be welded into machines that could approach the velocity of light and become, in a sense, immortal through downloading into robotic machinery. Other people for sure will try to return to the rainforest and sing their songs and sharpen their wooden implements with fire and all of this. Does that mean then that the idea of humanness is so linked to the body that it's now up for grabs or in question because of the possibilities that loom immediately ahead? I don't know. I agree with what Mark said last night, that the anchoring point has to be the body. It's a strategy we've talked about in other contexts, that when you don't know what's going on, when you lose your way, a very reasonable thing to do is to try to reason backward to the last sane moment you knew, and then act from those principles. And history is the whole of history is a fall away from authentic being in the felt presence of the moment. And what virtual reality and the acceleration of technology does is the favor of essentially tipping the game, showing us what is happening. The kind of analysis of media and cultural artifacts that has been possible since 1950, McLuhan and so forth and so on, was literally, those thoughts were unthinkable before that, because the reign of print-created linearity and positivistic understanding was so unquestioned that no one could lift their nose back from it to even inquire what it was. The whole last half of the 20th century is the dawning realization, the same personal journey that Mark made, we all made in some way, which was the realization that reality is not only not what it appears, but what it seems to be is something barely imaginable, Englishable, and discussable. That, the cheerful assumptions of three-dimensional space and the virtue of hard work and chastity just, if it hasn't flung itself apart for you yet, it soon will.
Before we leave one of the things you were just talking about, it was something that occurred to me. And I'm wondering, when we talk about uploading and downloading from one form to another, and if we look at the body as a machine, are we not downloading information from those living items that we ingest into our body and digest? And if we're talking about DNA as information, well, we're taking that into our body, somehow we're processing it, whether it's nothing else but nutritional purposes, whatever. And when our body itself disincorporates and it goes into the ground, are we not then uploading back into the larger living system? That we have the commonality of the water, H2O, as a carrier system. It just seems to me that a lot of times we see these science fiction scenarios as something separate from our existence that we know, and I think it's an existence that we know already. It's a similar type of process, reprocessing, that we're quite familiar with. We just don't remember it.
Well, I think all of, there's a view of nature that is certainly in the ascendant, that it is all chemically mediated information flows, that everything is essentially in communication with everything else, and that, in fact, when you step further back, it is just a seamless chemical mind. The distribution of DNA in the environment, the way acidity is regulated by breakup of leaf material. I recall memorizing when I was studying jungle ecosystems the factoid that organic material born in rainwater in the Amazon flows on average no more than 0.5 millimeter before being reabsorbed into an organic system. So, there is not a lot of unused disk space in that system.
Very efficient compression.
Yes, it's definitely maxing out. One of my hopes for all of this is that nanotechnology will lead, and so will propagating the frontier of molecular biology, to the understanding that at the level where nature is computing, single atomic systems and molecular lattice work is what's utilized. If we are serious about perfecting our design process, then what we today think of as infrastructure should simply gently fade away as we learn how to piggyback and timeshare with the already extant submolecular computational machinery that binds the planet together anyway. I mean,
as many of us have experienced, if you take enough LSD 25, you can actually see this happening.
Well, mycelial networks, when you grow mushrooms and you see how it ramifies through the soil, and you realize that the clamping junctions that it makes are very complicated chemical environments not dissimilar to what's going on in a synapse. And then you read that they find these mycelial mats on a scale of acres. Right. And the age of the things can't even be calculated. And, well, nature is very efficient. A system that works on one level efficiently will reoccur in other levels and in other applications. And I think the part of the end of the print-created linear Christian positivist dispensation, etc., is the recognition that mind extends infinitely in all directions. It isn't all rationally apprehendable to the primate neural architecture, but the ocean thinks, the continents think, the solar system thinks, the sun thinks. Can we think what they think? Probably not. But then an infinite frontier of potential intellectual evolution opens up through the concept of an unlimited project of understanding. Whitehead once pushed on the subject of understanding, said, understanding is the apperception of pattern as such. That's all it is, pattern as such. Well, any given context, a room full of people, a coral reef, a planetary system, will display, if you observe it carefully enough, an infinite number of patterns as such. And as you discover one and then another, you feel this aha experience which we associate with an epiphany of understanding, one of the coolest things that a human being can experience. So this is why what Mark said last night about virtual reality being a tool for seeing nature at different scales is so, that gets my wheels turning, because I want to see planetary processes. I want to see the heat flow from the polar ice caps to the equator. I want to understand the salinity of the oceans. I want to grasp the speed at which volcanism is altering the seafloor and the atmosphere. Well, these are God. This is what God does. Is sits around and watches creation at the interesting scales, and it not only can be done, it is being done, and it will be done better and better. And there was the old cliche back at the dawn of the space age, as guys went into orbit for the first time and out to the moon, the epiphany of seeing the whole Earth at once. And they said, well, we can't explain it to you, but when you see it, a blue-green pea spinning in the darkness, you're never the same. Well, we all can see that, and much more. You can see to the mantle. You can pull out to the Oort cloud and see the entire solar system shrink down to a spinning dot. You can lose that in the vastness. And all of this stuff is not without consequence. The virtual reality in some people's mouths becomes almost a dismissive term, but that's because they're objectification freaks and don't understand that the power is in the information. You know, I mean, I feel that I've been on the surface of Titan, that I understand the lava fields of Io, that I've walked the valleys of Mars, because I've been to all those places informationally.
But you prefer Hawaii.
The air's better.
You said that you feel as though you've been in these places through virtual reality demonstrations, or through psychedelic experiences, or both?
Well, I haven't logged thousands of hours in virtual reality. I'm sure Mark has, but I consider the internet a virtual reality. You know, every web page, every JPEG, every download, you're in some kind of multimedia information space. For instance, when I said I had walked the valleys of Mars, what I meant was there's one site that has what's called a self-scaling map of Mars. You go to this web page, you see the entirety of Mars, you set your cursor, you start clicking, and it just keeps opening, and it can go down to 30 meters anywhere on the planet. And you feel it. I mean, if you've ever flown from LA to Phoenix on an airliner, you get a better view of the Martian desert than you do of the Anza Borrego desert when you make that air flight. I mean, you can, if there were anthills down there, you could count them. I did see Madonna's face, but I'll be issuing a coffee table book on that.
Exactly.
Did you want to talk for a while?
So let's take some of the themes that Terence was working with, particularly where it comes to inhuman points of view. And I want to talk about points of view for a little while. Because we have to start asking, as the media, as the information flow that we're embedded in is, in some ways, it's pulling us apart. The ego, as we experience it, and the ego sort of sits on top of awareness somewhere, and you can't touch it, you can't feel it. When you look for it, it's not there. But somehow there's a coherent unity that we believe that we experience. But it's being modified by these information flows. The interesting thing is that we assume most of the time that we have this coherent, consistent, regular ego, but it was probably never there. And let me illustrate. Let's say that you came to the session last night and you heard about the yoga session. You said, excellent, I'm going to be up, I'm going to be at the house, I'm going to be there at 7:30 in the morning. And you're firm about it, and you've made the decision, and you're going to do it, and you go to the hot tubs, and you sit in the hot tub for a while, and you maybe go and smoke some dope, and you go back to the hot tubs, and you relax, and all of a sudden it's 2 a.m., and the alarm goes off at 7:30. And the first thing you think is, I'm not doing yoga. Now this is an example. I'm quoting an example almost in toto as was given by George Gurdjieff to P.D. Ouspensky when Ouspensky was a student of his in the 20s, that in fact this I that we claim to have, this unity that we claim to be operating us at all times, isn't. It doesn't exist at all. There's a whole set of them. And they come and they go as they please. They can be based on whether you're dyspeptic from the oatmeal you had for breakfast, or whether you're mellow because you've just finished a set of yoga, or if you're deeply in love and it's evoking certain things. So in fact what we're doing is we're always taking strands and pulling them together into some sort of unity, which is, for the moment, who you are. Well, this information flow that we're experiencing, particularly with respect to the internet and with respect to virtual reality, appears to be amplifying and intensifying this drive to multiple personality. It appears to be making it more visible to us. And I'll give you a case in point. Sherry Turkle is a psychologist, child psychologist, developmental psychologist, and researcher who until recently was at the MIT, I believe, in the Media Lab. And she'd done a lot of research on people who use in spaces that are called either multi-user dimensions or multi-user dungeons, or shorthand MUDs. You enter into a MUD, and a MUD is generally a text-based virtual world. And to relate what you were talking about, I would think the internet is just as much VR. We have different levels of fidelity on the experience. Is it a visual experience? Is it an oral experience? Is it a typed experience, a textual experience? It doesn't seem to matter, because the virtual reality machinery we're always using at all times is up here. It's not something that's out there. We can maybe do better tricking ourselves from moment to moment if we have pretty pictures to look at, but really that's just a form of hypnosis. So we have people who are participating in these multi-user worlds, and part of what you do in this multi-user world is you create a character for yourself, and you live in that character while you're participating in that virtual world. And there are thousands of these moves and machines in colleges all across the country and at various research facilities, and people set them up in their homes, and they have themes. There's a Star Trek world, there's a Dune world, there's a world of, I think it's called Fuzzies, where the people run around and have sex with each other all the time, in very interesting configurations that are not necessarily associated with human biology. And so you find these characters and your character developing out of this, and you might have a very specific form of a character. I might be Xena, or a big warrior princess in one of these worlds. And when I'm interacting in this MUD, I'll take on all of the characteristics of this person. I'll functionally be this person. I'll draw the lines of my being together in a configuration that creates that person. So Turco looked at this and said, okay, what's the fundamental difference between this and an individual who is diagnosed with a multiple personality disorder, which has now been rephrased, I think, in DSM-4, a dissociative identity disorder. But we're familiar with the concept, right? People who have personalities that become dominant, but they have an entire sea of them. It's almost as if that normalcy that's in each of us in these particular individuals has been amplified to the point where the ego doesn't note the personalities coming and going. The personalities simply shove out, and they are the person. And then it submerges and another one comes out. Well, of course, there's a contextual difference, because at some level you're switching between your warrior princess self and your software engineer self at any moment in time. And you can make these contextual switches quickly, right? I could have one window on the screen, which is me typing into the MUD, and I can have another window, which is me typing a program. And if I'm really facile with the manipulation of my personality, I can go back and forth between these very quickly. I actually find that very difficult, because when I'm invested in a character, there's a lot of energy there, and so I don't want to make the transition too quickly. What we see, particularly in cyberpunk science fiction, is that this quality of dissociative identity is identified as a positive aspect. In William Gibson, repetitively you see the image of characters who are ridden by the Loa of Wudin, that they literally disassociate themselves and become a god form, and the god speaks through them. So this is one set of identities that are being drawn up because of information that they're drawing through the net, which is producing a new personality in them. I think, and I want to assert for testing, that our children particularly are becoming facile at this, because our children are growing up in this web of connectivity. A child who's 6 years old will never have known a world without the web, or without communications on a massive scale that can individuate particular parts of their personality in specific directions. One of my friends actually pointed out that this is all happening before their brains are fully formed, before the corpus callosum sort of shuts down their possibilities in a biochemical level for change. And that our children may in fact be very, very nimble at manipulating personalities, and they may not, as they grow up, see personality as the singular, coherent ego, which is an artifact of probably sort of Renaissance Western culture when the artistic ego was born, and may in fact see themselves as an identity that is shifting from moment to moment and contextualized and can really be highly individuated and it can still be them. That it's almost as if we're all coming out of the closet with different clothing on, and we can go back in and change the suit of clothing and come out. Now, that personality, those personalities can conflate not just in terms of gameplay or interesting forms like that, but one of the things that I believe will happen is that we'll be able to take, again, these inhuman points of view. So that it might be able to be possible to come up with a personality that can conflate its identity with the Gaian logos. Case in point, we haven't actually been up in a space shuttle to see the planet floating around. But I did see something pretty close in 1995. What I think of as the finest, the most seminal work of early virtual reality is a system that's known as T-Vision. And T-Vision is a supercomputer that uses a very large database to create a view of the planet as it is right now, and it's networked. So it's talking to weather satellites, it's talking to geographical data, and it's got an intense, huge, multi-gigabyte database of the Earth's surface. It runs on a supercomputer, and you sit with a beach ball-sized trackball